When you think of outlaws of the 1920s, the names Al Capone or Bonnie and Clyde may immediately come to mind. A lesser-known outlaw who landed on the FBI's most wanted fugitive list was a former circus star turned bootlegger from Virginia. He killed at least 5 men, but always maintained he only killed in self-defense. Folk songs were written about him, and he gained legendary status by escaping jail several times, even escaping the electric chair in Tennessee. Welcome to Southern Mysteries, exploring Southern history and true crime. I'm your host, Shannon Ballard. This is the story of the Appalachian outlaw, Kinnie Wagner. William Kenneth Wagner, commonly known as Kinnie Wagner, was born in Scott County, Virginia, in February 1903. Kinnie would later say the tragic death of his mother on Christmas Day 1909 broke him. His mother was the most important person in his life, and suddenly she was gone. By the following summer, Kinnie's father remarried, bringing a stepmother and her 4 children into the family, with Kinnie and his sister, all living in a one-room cabin. Within a couple of years, 2 children were born of the marriage, and that little cabin felt smaller with each passing day. Kinnie claimed his stepmother often reminded him and his sister they weren't her children, making them do without clothes and shoes, while her children got what they needed. Kinnie took to spending most of his time outside with the family's 3 dogs, becoming his best friends. Kinnie had a gift for training dogs to tree raccoons and hunt rabbits. He enjoyed hunting, and from the time he got his first gun, when he was 8 years old, he practiced often and developed expert marksmanship skills. He entered turkey shooting contests with men from his community, and he kept on winning. So much so that some men in the area wouldn't enter the contest if they knew Kinnie was shooting. They just knew the kid would win. By the time Kinnie was 14 years old, the one-room cabin he shared with his family had become a place where he fought with step-siblings and his stepmother. One day, he reached a breaking point, grabbed his rifle, and led his dogs along as he walked away from home forever. 2 days later, he arrived in Clinchport, Virginia, just in time to see the Richards brothers traveling circus workers setting up tents in town. Kinnie was taken in by the hustle and bustle of it all. He asked the workers if they needed help. He was hired to help set up and tear down the tents and help drive a team of mules to transport equipment to each town. Kinnie was thankful to be able to keep his dogs with him along the way and to have a guaranteed place to sleep each night. But he often argued with the boss over his pay and not being fed. The boss was a violent drunk who would have too much to drink and beat Kinnie, once attacking Kinnie by hitting him on the head with the butt of a pistol. The excitement of traveling to new places, like Georgia and Tennessee, was worth the trouble with the boss, so Kinnie stuck with it. When the circus made its way to Alabama, Kinnie got a shot to be featured in the show when the trick shot performer was too drunk to take to the stage. The boss knew Kinnie was a good shot, so he pulled him aside, handed him a pistol, and told him it was his time to shine. He was told he'd be introduced as Champion Cowboy Kinnie, and the boss handed him 3 walnuts. He explained all Kinnie had to do was toss those walnuts in the air all at once and shoot them before they hit the ground. If he pulled off the trick, he'd have a permanent place in the show. Kinnie walked to the stage, and the crowd quietly waited to see what kind of trick this kid could pull off. Kinnie took the walnuts, tossed them above him, and fired, hitting all 3 as the crowd went wild. Champion Cowboy Kinnie was a hit, performing his act with the walnuts and shooting buttons off of shirts for years to come. Kinnie Wagner was soon known as one of the best shots in the country. His popularity meant more tickets sold and more money for the boss, who withheld money from Kinnie while using the Champion Cowboy to promote the circus. Kinnie was frustrated and tired of being taken advantage of. When the show stopped in Meridian, Mississippi in 1924, 21-year-old Kinnie Wagner left the circus and settled down in Meridian for a while. He went to work for a lumber company, but wanted the chance to make more money. As it turned out, a local sheriff's deputy was running one of the biggest illegal moonshine operations east of the Mississippi. Kinnie offered up his skills and became a runner. The deputy paid Kinnie with cash and occasionally confiscated goods. He surprised Kinnie by paying him with a very nice watch. Kinnie realized he had been tricked when FBI agents came to town to investigate the illegal operation. The deputy sheriff allegedly turned the FBI on to Kinnie, telling them he suspected it was all Kinnie's operation. He claimed Kinnie had stolen the watch and cash he was carrying, so the FBI would have cause to immediately arrest him on theft charges. Kinnie was arrested, but refused to stay behind bars for long. He got his hands on a saw, overpowered a guard, and escaped, stealing a horse to ride home to get his guns and dogs and make a plan to get out of Mississippi. Newspapers covered every detail of the story, which made it harder for Kinnie to get out of the state. Kinnie's photograph was printed in papers alongside this detailed description. Wagner is a young white man, about 25 years of age, 6 feet tall, weighs 170 pounds, has black, coarse, wavy hair and brown eyes, has well-developed shoulders and chest and hips, lower extremities not so well developed. It is claimed that this man has several scars on his body, caused from bullet wounds. Kinnie made his way to an abandoned house where he remained until Christmas Eve, 1924. Around sunrise, his dog started barking, and moments later, he heard a deputy sheriff identify himself as Murdoch McIntosh of Greene County. The deputy told Kinnie they had him surrounded and ordered him to come out with his hands up. Kinnie opened the door, fired at the sheriff, and killed him instantly. Kinnie Wagner was on the run again, this time with a $1,000 bounty for the murder of a lawman. A posse of more than 100 men with bloodhounds tracked Kinnie, but he was able to evade capture. He knew how to make his way through trails and back roads and cover his tracks. Kinnie eventually made his way to Birmingham, Alabama, where he bought a horse and rode to East Tennessee. He met up with his sister, who offered him money, supplies, and a hideout in Kingsport. But there was really no hiding for Kinnie Wagner, who was now one of the most wanted men in the country, with his name and photo featured on the front page of many national papers. Someone recognized Kinnie in Kingsport and went to authorities, who quickly tracked him down and surrounded him at his hideout near the Holston River on April 13, 1925. When Kinnie made a run for it, authorities started shooting, and Kinnie pulled his pistol and fired back. He shot and killed deputies John Smith and H.D. Webb and seriously wounded policeman George Frazier. The Kingsport News wrote this of the shooting: "The tragedy was the most shocking and disastrous that has ever occurred in or about Kingsport. With 10 orphan children and 2 widows weeping in their homes, dozens of men of Kingsport and the vicinity turned out for the manhunt for the desperado." Kinnie made his way to Waycross, Virginia, where early the next morning, he walked into a store owned by D.R. Poe. He cautiously approached the owner, explained who he was, and told him he needed to turn himself in, but refused to hand himself over to officers of the law. Wagner offered to hand over his gun in exchange for protection from Poe and other witnesses, to ensure that when officers arrived, they'd have to arrest him rather than kill him. When the sheriff and his men arrived to take Kinnie into custody, Kinnie vowed he acted in self-defense when those officers of the law came for him in Kingsport. Public sentiment about Kinnie Wagner was divided. Many hated him and vowed he loved to kill. But while awaiting trial, Kinnie Wagner found support for his defense from an unlikely place: women from all over the country. When they saw pictures of this attractive young outlaw in newspapers, and heard his story that he had acted in self-defense, many women wrote letters to Kinnie and enclosed money to help with legal fees. When Kinnie stood trial in late April 1925, women crowded into the courtroom to get a glimpse of him. In the end, Kinnie Wagner was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by electric chair. Kinnie's defense team immediately entered a motion for a new trial based on the limited time they had to prepare a defense for their client. The motion was granted, but Kinnie was impatient and made his own path to freedom when he once again escaped. He made his way to Texas and on to Mexico. By early 1926, Kinnie was able to sneak past Border Patrol and made his way into San Angelo, Texas, where he caught a ride on a bus headed to Louisiana and on to Texarkana. On August 27th, Kinnie agreed to play poker with the Carper brothers, Sam, Will, and Bob. Late that night, as the drink flowed and the game continued, a fight broke out, and at some point, Kinnie pulled his gun and shot and killed Sam and Will. He later said he would have gotten Bob too, but it was so dark he couldn't see to shoot straight. Another posse, motivated by a $2,500 bounty on Kinnie's head, searched for the outlaw. He was found hiding in the woods of Miller County, Arkansas, and was prepared to fire the first shot and run again until he saw a woman leading the charge. Weeks earlier, the county sheriff had been killed in a moonshine raid gone wrong. His wife, Lily Barber, agreed to serve as sheriff in his place. When Kinnie saw the female law officer, he refused to shoot and surrendered, telling her he had too much respect for women to harm one. With the young outlaw in custody, a battle ensued between authorities in Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas, with each state arguing they should get custody of Kinnie to try him for murders committed in their state. Ultimately, because the first documented and confirmed murder at the hands of Kinnie Wagner was in Mississippi, authorities agreed he would be returned to the state to face trial. Kinnie was tried and convicted for the death of Deputy Sheriff McIntosh and sentenced to life in Parchman Prison in Sunflower County, Mississippi. While at Parchman, Kinnie learned he was viewed as a sort of hero among his fellow prisoners because he had battled a crooked sheriff. Songs were written about him in the 1920s, which turned him into a folk hero. Men feared and respected him, and women wrote him letters, vowing their love and devotion to the bad boy of Appalachia. Kinnie was so overwhelmed by love letters from women asking to marry him, he had to pay a fellow prisoner to pose as him and help him reply to the love letters. Now, Kinnie's good behavior behind bars earned him a trustee position in Parchman, which gave him certain privileges and freedoms. He was allowed to train the prison bloodhounds, and law enforcement called on Kinnie and those hounds when they needed to track prisoners out in the swamps. This was a common practice in prisons in the early 20th century. With a limited number of paid guards, trustees would be armed and used to help guard their fellow prisoners. Kinnie worked hard and earned a lot of favors, including extended pardon passes from the governor of Mississippi. The governor even granted Kinnie a 10-day pardon so he could visit his family in Virginia at Christmas. By 1940, 37-year-old Kinnie Wagner had served 14 years of his life sentence and appeared to have settled down. But things were never as they seemed with the outlaw Kinnie Wagner. Late one night, he and his hounds were called on to help track an escapee. While in the car with a guard, Kinnie turned his gun on the guard and made him pull the car over so Kinnie could make a run for it into the woods. Once Kinnie was out of sight, the guard opened the car doors, unleashed the hounds, and waited for them to track the fugitive. But the dogs refused to move. It turns out Kinnie had spent years training those hounds not to track him, and his training worked. Kinnie was free for 3 years until the FBI finally tracked him down and sent him back to Parchman, where prison officials let him fall back into familiar patterns. He was once again appointed trustee, even allowed to carry a machine gun during his posted guard hours, and went back to training bloodhounds. By 1948, Kinnie got that feeling, that need inside him to be free. While carrying his state-issued machine gun, he walked out of the front gate at Parchman and just kept walking. When the guards called in hounds to track Kinnie, they did as Kinnie had trained them to do. They laid down and refused to track him. Kinnie made it to Scuba, Mississippi, where he settled down and worked as a dog trainer for 8 years. It took nearly 9 years, but someone finally recognized the outlaw, Kinnie Wagner, and called the FBI. When Kinnie was returned to Parchman in 1956, he was a much different man. He was in his 50s, dealing with liver and heart conditions. His health issues meant he spent a lot of time in the prison hospital. But despite treatments, Kinnie was very weak and bedridden by 1958. On March 9th of that year, Kinnie received news that one of his favorite German shepherds, Queen, had puppies. He asked to see the puppies, and prison officials agreed. He sat with Queen, petted her, and then picked up one of her puppies. The story goes that Kinnie was overcome by the emotion and joy in that moment, so overcome that his heart couldn't take it and stopped beating. National headlines would tell the story of the death of one of the South's most notorious outlaws, the man who outfoxed many lawmen and killed at least 5 people, died while petting a puppy. Kinnie Wagner's body was turned over to his family and transported home to the mountains of Virginia. Before Kinnie was laid to rest next to his mother in his hometown, it's said that over 15,000 people stopped by the funeral home to pay their respects to the Appalachian outlaw. In his lifetime, legends often became facts when folks told a story about Kinnie Wagner. Some say he killed 5 men, but there are tales of Kinnie using an alias while on the run and killing dozens. His folk hero status led to Kinnie receiving help while he was on the run, when folks knew they should be turning him in. Thanks to Kinnie's growing fame, radio programs about his life, and even a comic book which seemed to play down the murders and focused on Kinnie's prison breaks and outwitting lawmen who pursued him, the public felt a lot of sympathy for Kinnie Wagner. Around Christmas of 1945, an interview with Kinnie was published in the Kingsport News. Reporter Eileen Crawford wrote that Kinnie wanted a pardon and felt he deserved one, considering the first person he killed had been a criminal alongside him, and as Kinnie explained, tried to kill him in cold blood. That first kill led to Kinnie having to run for his life, and as he told it, everyone else he killed died because he was in a kill or be killed situation. Kinnie said his greatest wish was to be freed and spend the rest of his life helping young people avoid a life of crime. He explained he had come from a broken home and did not have the guidance to keep him from making those bad decisions. Kinnie said he wanted to devote the rest of his life to helping young people see right from wrong, so they would not make the mistakes he had made. Those mistakes, Kinnie referenced, had consequences, which Mary Jane Thomas Carper addressed in an oral history. She recounted the story of the night Kinnie Wagner murdered her husband, Will, and her brothers-in-law, Sam and Bob. Here's what Mary Jane wrote. There have been many stories written about this killing. Many writers have played Kinnie Wagner up as some great hero. I would like for the public to know the truth of this matter. My husband, nor Bob, had a gun that night. In fact, the only gun that was ever drawn was Kinnie Wagner's. Sam had his gun on him that night, but he never got a chance to draw. When Sam's body was lifted off of the ground that night, his gun fell out from his trouser leg. My husband was killed August 17th, and I gave birth to another baby March 3rd. Can you imagine the mental anguish of raising 4 children up without a daddy? I never did marry anymore. I brought my children up as best I could on my own. I want you to always remember, Kinnie Wagner was no hero. Southern Mysteries is created and hosted by me, Shannon Ballard. You can find the sources for this episode and the full show notes at southernmysteries.com. If you enjoy this independent podcast, I hope you'll take the time to support the show by rating and reviewing Southern Mysteries where you're listening, and make sure you tap on the follow button so you never miss a new episode in your feed. If you're new to Southern Mysteries and you're wondering where you can listen to the first 3 seasons of the show, you can find those and get access to those episodes along with patron-exclusive podcasts and episodes through the years on the Southern Mysteries Patreon, which you can find easily if you have the Patreon app. Just look for Southern Mysteries or head directly to patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. All my patrons on the Southern Mysteries Patreon help make it possible for me to continue to tell stories like the one you've heard today. As a thanks, you get access to different tiers of content. There's 2 tiers you can choose from, and you'll find all the details when you head over to the Southern Mysteries Patreon. Thanks for checking that out, and as always, thank you so much for